Muy bien, por supuesto, agradecer las palabras del gobernador de Santiago, don Claudio Orrego, en esta interesante ponencia que nos ha traído hoy. Queremos saludar a quien se ha incorporado también a esta jornada, el alcalde de Curacaví, señor Cristian Hernández. Gracias por estar hoy con nosotros. El estudio Santiago Urban Age Task Force aborda políticas y acciones en torno a 6 ejes temáticos: desarrollo social para la equidad territorial, espacios públicos para todos, movilidad regional y metropolitana sostenible, medio ambiente y territorio resiliente, economía circular, innovación y turismo, y gobernanza multinivel con participación ciudadana. Santiago Urban Age presenta un conjunto de informes que recopilan las actividades de asesoría y participaciones realizadas, los análisis de encuestas y entrevistas con expertos, ejemplos internacionales de prácticas similares y recomendaciones sobre los desafíos y oportunidades para la implementación. Para dar inicio a este ciclo de paneles vamos a invitar a Ricky Burdett a este escenario. Él es arquitecto y urbanista británico, profesor de estudios urbanos en la London School of Economics and Political Science y director del proyecto LSE Cities y Urban Age, a subir a este escenario para que nos presente en profundidad las características y alcances de este estudio. Por favor, un fuerte aplauso para él.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, but I'm going to speak in English. I'm going to use a lot of slides, images, which translate to everybody in the room. Governor Orrego, thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you all for those fantastic hours yesterday of walking through your city in La Chimba, in Alameda, and talking to so many of you who are the principal actors of this project. A fantastic project, which we've just heard, which goes beyond the city. It's actually about changing the world of cities, and each has to learn from each other. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the brief time I have. I will be followed, as you know, by my colleagues, experts who have worked in different cities to give some more detail, but I want to talk about a sort of major comparative, global comparison between your city and other cities. So I start with this. I don't expect you to read anything, don't worry, okay? But in many ways, I think this follows on from what the governor was saying, that in order to know what we're doing, we first have to understand where we start from. Your statistics before were very interesting. But I'm going to just touch upon some of the comparisons between Santiago, other cities in Latin America, but also Europe, to show that actually some things are okay, other things are not okay, and you also need to invest in some other areas for improvement. That's the whole point of regional planning at the scale that is being proposed. But let me just stand back a little bit. You know, Santiago, of course, is not alone, not just in Chile, not just in Latin and South America, but in the world. Just think of this when you look at this map now. We all know the statistic that in only 25, 30 years from now, 75% of the world will be urban, 75%. That's not dissimilar from you are already very urbanized in Chile, that I know, over percent. But what these big numbers show you is the time, in 1 hour, how many people are moving into or are born into the cities that you see there, okay? So Lagos, 76 people per hour. That means every minute I'm speaking to you, one new person has arrived or is born there. So think of the problems in terms of infrastructure, housing, sanitation, everything else. You're doing okay, right? You're growing slowly, maybe not as much as you thought from the recent census. But of course, other cities in the world in blue are going the wrong way. Japan is depopulating. Much of ex-Russia is depopulating. Parts of Eastern Europe in the same. So the main thing is to understand where you sit in that global scenario, and this shows where you sit in terms of actually economic growth, not population growth. Now, some cities, let's see what the effect is of Donald Trump's inspired decisions over the last few days, some cities are growing at quite significant economic speed. Again, you're sort of on the average middle to low, shall we say, but at least you're growing. Without growth, of course, as Orrego has already said, without growth, without investing on your assets, you're not going to go anywhere. You're going to go actually backwards. And I think this is important to remind ourselves. The real challenge of cities have to be dealt with in the next 10, 20 years, not in 50 years. All the problems and the infrastructure, how we deal with making equitable and climate change friendly cities have to be dealt with now. That's why there's this urgency. It's not just a political issue, it's a real issue facing these global cities. Now, our project, which started about 9, 10 months ago, has several elements to it. And as you know, this project is a collaboration with USACH, Rodrigo Martin, with of course the regional government and many other of the municipalities involved in this study that we've done. And basically there are going to be 2 publications and 2 pieces of work which come out of it. One is this one that you see here and is available, will also be available to be downloaded, in fact, in Spanish. But also we've had a series of very detailed workshops over the last 9, 10 months and looking at the regional development strategy, which you launched, of course, last year, to really drill in and say, what can you do on the ground? So we're taking 6 of the areas, you see those documents on the right-hand side, and we're developing policy briefs, which will be ready in about 3, 4 weeks from now, which you can download and will be available as printed documents. This is to work with you to help you in the regional government deliver some of these ambitious and important initiatives. Now, as I say, we've held a number of workshops, which includes many of you in the room. Over 60 people have taken part in the whole process over this period of time. So we're coming from a point of the beginning of understanding what is actually happening to the city. And just in the last few days, I think you'll recognize the man with the jacket in the middle of the slide there, the governor taking us through La Chimba yesterday. But what we've done is tried to focus in on some of the project areas, some of the big themes to do with equity, to do with territorial development, to do with green and blue infrastructure, and learn from other cities such as Milan, Barcelona, and others. We've looked at around 10, 15 different cities in the world to see what's been done and how well it's done. Just some bullet points here, and then I'll conclude also with some other reflections at the end. Let's start. Santiago's doing pretty well. I mean, it's not a city in crisis. It has problems, challenges, like many other cities around the world. You guys, the regional government, is here to stay. It wasn't the case 10, 15 years ago. Now it is the case, so one has to make that work. But I have to say that from all the work we've done, for the regional government to be more effective than it has to be, it needs more power, more powers, in fact. Obviously, money helps too, but central government is here to help. But I think that other point of instruments and capacities, in other words, what are the vehicles, what are the institutions you create, and who are the people, these people, actually there? Do they have the capacities, or as Isabel calls it, the competencies, the skills, to actually deliver this change? And I think every city has to invest, and you do too. Now, we felt that the ERD, the Regional Development Strategy, is a very, very strong point of development. It has all the right sort of parameters. But again, drilling down and getting things done is going to be different. And I think one has to say, we saw the slides before from Orrego, you know, to build on your strengths. Seen from the outside, these are some of your strengths. The fact that you have urban density, that you're not Los Angeles or the city of Mexico, which goes on forever and ever and ever. Actually, you have a large region, but the built form is actually quite tight, and we'll come back to that in a moment. You have extraordinary assets. We're jealous, of course, that you have mountains and the sea and wine, which is nearly better than Italy, which is where I come from. You have an extraordinary climate, and you have exceptionally well-educated and trained human capacity. That's very, very rare in terms of sort of the delivery at what I would call the metropolitan and municipal level. That is not the case across the world. And you have an economy which, of course, goes up and down, but is relatively strong. So we've done this work which looks at the DNA of your city. You've already seen some of these statistics before. But it's just useful to sort of stand back and see where the city is. Okay, it didn't grow as much as you expected perhaps, but it's still a city of really significant size. London is just over 8 million, New York is just roughly the same. So we're talking about that scale of city, with that scale of potential over time. You may have, yes, a lot of cycle lanes. We saw that, and there are going to be more, but perhaps they're not as used as much as perhaps that other cities say, like Paris, not to mention Copenhagen. So this is a snapshot of what's actually happening. And then Orrego, the governor, ended with the issue of governance. Now just look at this picture, right? Where is Santiago, right? I mean, that's the issue. Where would you put a red line if you had to decide how to manage it properly? And I think that is exactly the debate you're now having, and all these other cities have had this debate over time. And that's why it's just interesting to think of what is the scale of which we're talking about, and then the delineation of the sort of potential. I mean, just in terms of sheer scale, you know these numbers. If you take the region, the bigger picture, this whole slide over there, we're talking about 15,000, we're talking about 15,000, which is compared, look at the other cities down the list. City of Ciudad de Mexico City is only 1,500. So, I mean, it would be 10 times, or is 10 times larger than that. Look at Paris. It's 1/10. In fact, it's 105 of that. But it's a smaller city. It's just the center of the area. So these issues need to be taken into account when the analysis is being made at the moment of what actually constitutes what I would call, Governor, the functional administrative urban area, metropolitan area. And I know this is a debate which is going on now, but you're not alone. In London, as Peter Bishop will say in a moment also, we've had a very, very similar sort of debate. And it's only 25 years ago that we invented a directly elected mayor. We did not have one before. Now, the most important thing of these two slides is the gray bit, right? The gray bit is actually where people live or work. It's where the buildings are. And the red line, in the case of London, you can see on the right-hand side, is where the mayor has powers. So the red line roughly surrounds exactly where people live, pay taxes, work, right? And I think that is, of course, the challenge when you have such a vast region and people live, of course, in other parts of the wider metropolitan region, but also with a great concentration. How to balance those two seems to be essential. So we did some work saying, okay, what powers does the governor, the mayor of these 3 or 4 cities that we've compared? And the first thing to say by looking at this, so this is a DNA of the governance structure. And in blue, it's central government, so the Ministry of Housing, for example here, Ministry of Transport. In red is the governor-mayor authority, and in green is the municipalities. Now, I don't need to tell you that you've got a few more layers than other cities, right? In other words, there are several layers of governments actually which have strong impact on what happens on the ground in your city. And in the case of London, you'll notice that there are only 3. And that the red, which is the new, I'd say 25 years mayor of London, actually has very strong powers now over transport, over housing, and many other things. For the only things that are not involved, for example, are health and education. So that means that the government can be more efficient in delivering the sort of change around the vision set by the mayor or the governor. And if you take 2 other cities, obviously in your region, it's quite interesting to see how Lima and Bogota also have similar differences. On the right, Lima, probably a more layered system, maybe not so efficient. Bogota is, in many ways, I would say, a model of how to get things done, as we've seen over the last years. Now, I stress, this is not to say that anything is perfect. It's just one has to understand how your city works and what's the best form of governance to actually make it function more efficiently. So what we've done in our work is looked at 4 or 5 parameters. All of those are in this document in much greater detail, so I'm just going to go through it very, very quickly. But if we take the issue of density, density means how many people live together. So the diagrams we've developed at the London School of Economics on the right show the tallest spike being the highest density. So imagine if in this room there's all of you, as there are, it's full, you have a very tall spike. If in this room we have half of you, it would be lower. If in this room there were only the first 2 rows, it would be very flat, right? This is not the height of buildings, it's the density, right? Which is, of course, a measure also of efficiency. The more dense a city is, the better the public transport, the communication system, and everything else, schools, everything else around it. So it's not just a sort of planner's thing, it's much more significant than that. And Santiago, on the top left of the diagram, is actually very dense, the administrative area. It's a great asset, absolutely something to build on. And if you look at Paris, which is the second, depends, they have fights with Barcelona as to who's denser, whether it's Barcelona or Paris in Europe, we're talking about similar levels. Okay, we're not Singapore, which is 30, 40-story buildings sort of everywhere, but we're getting closer to that, and nothing like the sort of flat potato that London is. We're much flatter, right? Much more like a pizza, for example. Now, this means obviously being able to build on the efficiency of this density, which I think you have there. Another question, of course, already alluded to by the pictures from Orrego, is the other side of density, the green space. How do you breathe? How do you live? Where do you have the lungs? Post-COVID, we realize what an asset that is in the city. And of course, Santiago actually has relatively low numbers within the city. That also depends on how you calculate it, by the way, I know. But you have this extraordinary asset that within kilometers of the city, you have one of the most extraordinary sort of mountain ranges and nature which is available to you. How to connect to that and how to integrate the planning of that around the blue and green infrastructure is one of the central policy brief areas. Now, I said at the beginning, not everything is perfect. Some things can be improved. If we look at how people travel, these diagrams on the right show in gray people using cars on a daily commuting pattern in 4 cities, Paris, Santiago, Bogota, and Mexico City. In the darker blue, those who take metro, public transport, and in the lighter blue, people who walk or cycle. Now, I think everyone understands here that at the moment, the citizens of Santiago rather like their cars. In fact, it's 34% using cars at the moment. There are aspirations to, of course, reduce that. And what is fascinating to me is to see that Paris, smaller city, denser city, of course, I realize and I repeat, but it actually is now only 9% of the population actually, and actually very low number of people own cars. There's been a significant investment in cycles, but importantly, more people use the cycle lanes than they ever did before. It's an extraordinary change in attitude and everything else. So there's a lot to learn there. Now, this is a sort of always a difficult comparison to make, but worth knowing where one stands. This is looking at the public transport system, which includes BRT or other forms of transport like the metro. And of course, in Santiago, it's relatively new in that sense. It's been an investment over a short period of time. In London, on the bottom right, it's nearly 1,000 kilometers of rail and underground systems. We started 155 years ago. 155 years ago. Beijing, on the other hand, started in 2001, and they've got 867 kilometers. But it's a different country, a different approach. I'm not saying that's the model. But things can be done if the investment is there. And the final thoughts I want to present in terms of the data is this cross-section, as I say, a brain scan of certain other fundamental aspects that the governor has talked about, which is inequality. Now, your city is divided. It's clearly divided. It's divided in terms of what we saw, the amount of green space, the amount of access to what one might call assets. But I see that as long as one recognizes where you're starting from, a potential for change. Now, in the case of Santiago, the darker red colors show the higher deprivation. The lighter colors are the opposite. Every city has its own. London, for example, if I were to show that, would have the sort of central areas actually quite deprived. The western and the whole edge of the city, very affluent. It's actually very, very different. The question is, it's a starting point of what to do next. Now, you've experienced, as you see on the right-hand side, you all know this, you talk a lot about it, and these 2 days that we've been here, is unexpected international migration. This has fueled the inequalities in your city, also by moving into some areas which are already of higher inequality. How to deal with that becomes absolutely essential. So here, in many ways, I want to just pause and say we've offered you, through this study, in the first phase, a sort of an analysis of where you stand in relation to other cities, not to say that others necessarily do it better, but to understand what the possibilities actually are. Now, in terms of our detailed workshops, in terms of the analysis we've made, as I say, through the policy briefs which will be coming out shortly, just a few reflections, just to put there in form of discussion. It seems like a banal thing to say, but urban regeneration is not just about planning. It's not even just about transport. It's about social value. It completely changes the way your children and their children will actually feel who they are and what they're entitled to. It's very, very important that public space is seen as part of that, not just stuff, green or playgrounds. It's much, much more fundamental in terms of the equity equation that we've talked about before. The other thing to recognize is these projects take years. The King's Cross project that we'll hear about in London has taken at least 25 years to get to where it is. Therefore, important to do quick wins, but to always think about the longer term. Where is this place going to be in 20, 30, or even more years from now? Significantly, who pays for all that is fundamental. It may be the state, it may be the region, it may be other scales, but the private sector is always going to play a very significant part in changing cities. And there are ways of bringing in investors who have a patient approach. They don't want a return in 2 or 3 years. They may want a return in 10, 20 years if they're pension funds, for example. So working with intelligent investors is very much part of the way of going forward. Tactical urbanism, I think you understand. Other colleagues will talk about that. It's very important to have quick wins. And I don't need to say it to you, Claudio, but be brave. You know, doesn't matter where we all don't agree at the moment. You got elected, get on with it. You know, and I think that's important. And we've learned very clearly in the last day, but also from discussions with our colleagues at regional government, that it's the fuzzy bits in between the different 52 boundaries, which sometimes are just forgotten, or they're politically not that worth investing in. And of course, those are the touch points. Those are the most difficult areas that need to. It's like in a body, you know, what part of the vein doesn't work? What part of the artery is blocked? And I think that is all part of it. The other thing which I think has come out very clearly from our work is that the regional government, you guys here and others, need to act as brokers, not just regulators. You've got to invent, you've got to create, you've got to talk, and therefore that requires skills which may not yet be there. And that's between public and private and between the 3 levels of government that are represented here. One obvious way, which we've done in London, Barcelona for sure, you'll hear, is to identify those areas, yeah, like La Chimba, but there are others which need special attention and maybe special ways of governing those developments, and that's what we call opportunity areas. We've certainly learned in 4 of the cities represented here that you start, if you're intervening in areas in front of schools, people feel it, right? Whether it's better paving, low traffic zones, improving security, a massive difference, and it affects, of course, families and the next generation. But I think the notion of actually building new institutions, which I talked about at the beginning, for example, Design for London was the mayor's team of about 30, 40, 50 people. We will hear later that in Milan there's an Officina Aperta, sort of a laboratory, which is 60, 70 sort of people, but just dedicated to that. Barcelona, all this is copied from Barcelona, I have to say, which you started about 30 years ago. So the final point to make here is that I really feel that in order to achieve all of this, to be of a standard of city which builds on what your assets are compared to others that you consider sort of colleague cities in the world, you need to invest probably more in skills and capacity building across all levels of government. I'm going to end there, but obviously there are one or two messages I want to leave. First of all, nothing like this could happen without an extraordinary team of people. You're not going to read the names here, there are too many of them. But the collaboration with USACH, Rodrigo Martin and his colleagues, I want to thank. The collaboration, obviously, Isabel, Brahim, and all the colleagues in regional government, essential. We've had representations from academia, from many other departments, of course, up and down the regional, national, and municipal government. I think that's made an enormous difference. I'm going to plug the London School of Economics Executive Masters because that's all about capacity building. But also I want to end by asking Josefa Zuriz for making much of this happen, including the publication of this event. Claudio, thank you for making this happen for us. Thank you.